No, but I'm excited to find out. Okay. Just curious.
All right. Let's see, what do I need to hit to maximize the screen here?
You'll probably have to go to view in the above left,
Mhm.
and then there's no, just in the Adobe.
Oh, in the Adobe up here.
Yeah,
Yes.
there's view, and then there's full screen mode.
Full screen on. Go with that. Yeah. All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, folks who are here in person, and to our global audience from whatever continent you may be attending. This is the first in a series of lectures that we will be offering here at the McLean Center for the Study of Culture and Values at the Catholic University of America. The title of the series is Moving the Needle: Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Motivating Ecological Change. The short name for this lecture series is The German Invasion. And so we have the first, the vanguard of the German invasion today is our speaker, Dr. Ivo Frankenreiter. But please mark your calendars for additional talks that will take place in this series. The next one will be on March 23rd. We'll have another event on March 28th. And finally, on April 11th. Those will all be in the midday hour here, East Coast time. And they will all address this compelling question of how to harness the various disciplinary perspectives that we have at our disposal to not just expand our knowledge of environmental degradation and ecological crisis, but to actually motivate people to help along transformations, or as some people have put it, ecological conversion, which is necessary if these truly epochal problems are to be addressed. Now, our lecturer today comes to us from the Ludwig-Maximilians-University in Munich, the University of Munich, where he is an instructor and works closely with Professor Markus Vogt on the Catholic Theological Faculty there. He has been working in this field for some time and has offered a number of different presentations linked in various ways to this topic. I'll mention just a few that he's been kind enough to give in English. His topics include intergenerational justice in Christian thought, the resources of religious diversity for socio-ecological change. You can see how that's related to our theme. Process materialism, question mark, understanding matter within a Whiteheadian cosmology. And finally, a process ontological approach to creation and to the ethics of transformation. Now, those last two topics already point to his interest in process thought, and in particular, the work of Whitehead. He is involved with the community of Whitehead scholars here in the US, including John Cobb, who's close to 100 years old now. Speaking today on the epistemology of change in nature, environment, and society, please welcome Dr. Ivo Frankenreiter.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm here for 1 week, so I don't only have the pleasure of 1 day, but of 1 week. And it's an honor to speak to you in this mini series of talks on this whole question we'll just describe. To give you a little bit of context of what I'm going to do today, the epistemology of change in nature, environment, and society was the subtitle of my recently concluded dissertation. The title was Process Ontological Ethics of Transformation. So in some of the other titles Bill just mentioned, those aspects were stronger in the center. Now we will focus on these questions of epistemology, but the overarching focus is still environmental ethics, especially the whole question of basically, why does the societal reaction to climate change looks the way it looks, despite of all the knowledge we have about climate change and its consequences, and maybe any thoughts how it should look different than it does. So this is the overarching question, and within that spectrum, we will have a look on epistemology, and especially the epistemology of change in those fields that are most broadly described by those three terms: nature, environment, society. So just to stay a little longer with this title, why epistemology? Because it, first of all, it sets a certain path of how we think about certain things, the way we address them. For example, if we take the term change and compare it with other notions to describe processes of change in society, it does make a big difference whether we talk about just change or whether we talk about a crisis or even a catastrophe. So this is a first glimpse on those differences our thoughts and our concepts make towards our response to certain things. The second part of the title, why nature, environment, society? Well, just in this case, to use very broad terms to point to what it is, where this change in this most broadest sense happens, that we have to talk about when we talk about climate change. So also there, we have a concept like nature, derived from Latin natus, so being born, used as a counter concept to culture, mostly to point to things that grow out of themselves, so not due to human interaction with them. So in this broad sense, it's kind of the opposite, but compared to environment, we see that it's much more a self-enclosed term, while environment, from Old French, environ, to surround something, is much more of a relational term. So in these areas, all those different questions of how the forms of our thinking, the concepts we use to think about certain things, reshapes how we are to engage with them. So this is the broad spectrum of questions that kind of stands behind this specific approach to all the problems climate change and the reaction to it holds for us. So within this realm, more specifically as to what I'm going to do today, the basic premise I just start off from, I will not take time to prove to you, is that there is a discrepancy between what we know about climate change and how we respond so far. I'll just take that as granted. Given what we know about climate change and have known for several decades now, the reactions should have been different to avoid certain consequences, and they have not. So I basically take that as a premise. Now, the thesis we're going to talk about today is that how we know in which terms we think about climate change and its effects is what shapes how we respond to them. This tries to point to this question of why are we talking about epistemology and how should we be able to engage in it in order to, well, in the end, tackle this discrepancy included in the premise. So what I'm going to do today is, in the first step, take a general approach to epistemology, just to give you an idea of what is it that we talk about when we use this traditionally heavily loaded term epistemology, and also to what extent it will be relevant for us today. Then the second part is, why is epistemology our problem? We don't just talk about because it is fun. It may be in some cases, but that's not the reason why we do it in ethics. If it is a problem for environmental ethics, then the third step is to show and see how epistemology as the challenge we have to engage in for our ethical concerns. There's other microphones that are. Oh yeah, probably. Okay, then I'll just continue. And then the fourth step, kind of the concluding outlook, will be my proposal as to how we can engage in those epistemological issues in order to tackle this whole discourse field of climate change. So, how to get in touch with epistemology? In the most broadest sense, the question of what is epistemology can be summarized by this quote I brought you from the Stanford Encyclopedia article on epistemology. After listing some approaches to epistemological questions today, they conclude their paragraph with, in all these cases, epistemology seeks to understand one or another kind of cognitive success or correspondingly cognitive failure. So this distinction between how do we get to have cognitive success in certain aspects, when is it that there happens something like cognitive failure, is what epistemology basically is about. So the whole question, just from the etymology of the word, the ology, some sort of the reasoning in episteme, science. So basically the question of when our rational thinking processes are able to have success and when they end up with failure. The traditional realm where those questions became relevant and what kind of stands behind what we are going to do today is that epistemology was used to question the rational possibility and, in this instance, point to the impossibility of metaphysical questions. The basic list of names that go in those traditional directions are Rudolf Carnap, who started out with saying that, well, basically metaphysical questions are utterly nonsense because this basic thing of since it is only abstract questions far away from our experience, there is no method to decide between cognitive success and cognitive failure. So this basic distinction of epistemology. And so Carnap's whole point was to say, since there is no distinction between cognitive success and cognitive failure, all we get to is cognitive failure. And so let's just get away from metaphysics. Does this your question? Oh, okay, good. I won't go through this whole line of the steps with Karl Popper, Oliver Orme-Quine, Imre Lakatos, Thomas Kuhn, but what they all discussed was this question of, is there a way to, in some way, rationally engage in metaphysical questions or not? So what epistemology pointed to in this case was, do we have concepts to ask those questions, or do we have to leave out those questions entirely? So this is kind of the general spectrum of what epistemology is and how we are going to move within that framework. So to the next step. Why is this sort of abstract questioning metaphysical abilities now becoming a problem for environmental ethics? I won't be able to take too much time on this question, but there has been quite a lot of work done in recent years, especially, or the two authors I mostly used for that. One, the German sociologist Ulrich Beck, and B, the French sociologist, philosopher, many things, Bruno Latour. Despite all the differences in their methodological approaches, they do come to a certain point in their recent works that points to this exact thing of how epistemology or epistemological questions, or more precisely epistemological premises that are not discussed, become a problem precisely because they are not discussed. So just to summarize that real quick, what Ulrich Beck points to is that what he calls the world risk society and the process of reflexive modernization cannot be answered within the established categories they are. Or we as modern people try to answer them with things like expert knowledge and methodological nationalism. The reason for this being world risk society for Beck is precisely pointing to a global society that is in how it develops and what it is defined by risks that are essentially global. So things like climate change, financial crisis, as risks, as anticipations of catastrophes. They basically don't care about national borders. Climate change doesn't care about national borders. So things like the sovereignty of a nation state, taken as a basic premise to approach a problem like climate change, is going to fail, because our way of thinking about possible solutions basically uses premises that the problem doesn't care about. And so this tension between some sort of transnational approach to national borders that is essential to understanding the problem is basically totally missing in our concepts, how we try to use to get solutions with that. And Latour does quite the same thing for him in his volume Facing Gaia. What he builds up is the term nature. He writes it only with a capital N, but in the German version it's all caps, so that's why I have it here. Nature for Latour is what kind of took the place of religion in modernity. So nature, not just taken as the trees out there, but nature as this overarching entity of objective truth, of this guarantee beyond all political controversy. So nature as this basic guarantor of all truth that enables a sort of knowledge which is not subject to human disagreements anymore. And so since we think of, or as long as we as moderns, which is Latour's term for us, as long as we think about nature in this sense of nature being the objective truth that solves all political conflict, we keep waiting for nature to do exactly that with climate change, to give us a sort of knowledge that ends political conflict about climate change. This way, we just keep on waiting for more and more scientific data and keep wondering why it doesn't solve the political conflict of how to engage with it. So without getting further into those, I hope it is enough to see why epistemology or epistemological questions tend to be an essential part of the problem for them, because it's this discrepancy between, on the one side, the concepts that are used to A, define problems, and then B, to think about possible solutions for those problems. And on the other side, the problems themselves, which are in some sort different than what we make of them, given that for back between this world risk society with its transnational problems, an approach of methodological nationalism has to fail short in every case to get to a viable solution for those problems, especially because there is this epistemological gap between the problem has certain properties that our concepts to think about the problem basically just doesn't get.
You're muted.
See, there we go.
Thanks. Wow. I'm somehow impressed and a little bit puzzled because I don't know how I got to it. How much?
That was just for 10 seconds or so.
Okay. Okay. So I just restart here. Okay. So just again, to summarize back in Latour, what they point to is an epistemological critique that the concepts used to understand certain problems, and essentially problems like climate change. So this is why both authors are immensely important for us doing environmental ethics. The concepts used to understand the problem are a decisive part of the problem itself. So not the problem climate change, but the problem political reactions to climate change, because those political actions are formed by the concepts used to understand the problem in the first place. So what that means for ethics is basically that it has to consider both sides. A, the changes in nature, so what we describe as climate change, or given that climate change is also only one part of, we now at least have this image of planetary boundaries with all those different aspects of planetary systems being in constant change towards certain tipping points and all this. So ethics has to consider this side of changes in nature, but also the corresponding processes in society, not only in terms of the factual political reactions to those changes in nature, but also to the question of what is it that shapes those political answers. And a good example in this regard to point to this specific role of processes of change in both nature and society is that even the relative stability of fossil-based industrial metabolism or fossil-based society is only enabled by an accelerated transformation of fossil resources. So the basic function of change, or the basic role processes of change play in both those sides, is even a big issue where it seems to us that nothing changes at all, like with our fossil-based industry. Even there, the relative stability is only enabled by accelerated change in some other place. If we take epistemology as a basic part of the problem, so the whole question of cognitive success and cognitive failure with regard to how we understand our problems that make us engage in ethical discourse, because the consequences of those problems are by no means morally neutral. So if epistemology is a big part of the problem, then it is, for ethical reflection, also a big part of the challenge. And so the whole question is, how can we approach these challenges in order to find a constructive way to engage in them? And one basic tension this can be understood in is that we, on the one side, we have to stick with some kind of homogeneous thinking or some kind of coherence in the rational schemes we use, in the concepts we use, so that there has to be some kind of sticking together of those concepts, some kind of homogeneous structures to them. But the world we try to describe with them is basically heterogeneous, and this is a certain tension for us when we try to make sense of the world. Just a few examples to give you an idea of what this tension between homogeneous thinking and heterogeneous world points to. Physics, usually successful in recent decades and centuries in describing the world, and yet we'll probably all agree that if you just take physics to describe the reality of a painting, then you will fall short of just getting the sense of the painting, because there's another layer of, in the broadest sense, reality to that painting that is in some decisive way heterogeneous to physical thinking and has to be made sense of nevertheless. So what physics can explain about a painting is by no means false, but it is an abstraction from certain other aspects of what it talks about. Another example would be the status of human beings in a reductive materialism. Also, if we take physics, or more precisely, some sort of metaphysically enhanced way of taking physics as a descriptor of the whole of reality and not just the physical aspect of reality, then we end up with human beings being just some kind of physical automatism, and we have no space left to include something like freedom, or basically just subjective experience. But the problem also can be seen on the other side. If we take some kind of Cartesian dualism and humans as rational subjects as the big exception from all the physical world, because res cogitans, res extensa, then we tend to end up with humans as the singular intrinsic value, which brings us to a big part of all those problems we discussed about with things like anthropocentrism, especially with regard to climate change, because it brings us to an image of the use of this concept of a distinction between matter and mind, which makes a certain sense with regard to humans, leads to certain problems when transferred unambiguously on the world as a whole. And so this tension between how coherent, how homogeneous does our thinking have to be, and how do we still get to acknowledge the heterogeneity of the world in a sense that is good enough to not lead to cognitive failure, is the big challenge here. And so just to sum that up, on the one hand, we have, or if we take epistemology as the part of the problem, and we ask ourselves how this layer of questions can be constructively spelled out, the tension we have is that on the one hand, we have an extreme of, once this discussion becomes just a merely abstract glass bead game in, lacking for a better word, the German Glasperlenspiel can be used. I'm not sure whether the English one is familiar as an image here, but I hope you get the idea behind it. It's just if we use epistemology or metaphysics just as something that is an abstract building of concepts without any decisive contact to experience, then we just end up with a beautiful system of thought which won't be able to help us in any way with those problems of environmental ethics, basically because it is designed to be merely abstract. So this is the one extreme, and also basically the reason why people like Rudolf Carnap try to denunciate metaphysics altogether. But on the other hand, if we get to this extreme of a total denunciation of metaphysical terms and questions, if we just were to follow Carnap in his course, then this is the exact thing that leads to the implicit power of presupposed answers to those questions. So the whole thing Latour and Beck try to point out is that it is not a question whether the answers to ontological or epistemological questions should play a role or not, because they do. The whole way of how we engage with nature and its processes, how we engage with things like climate change as a problem of the world risk society, is pre-shaped by certain assumptions that belong to the realm of ontological and epistemological questions. And if we do not discuss those questions, because we think we have learned that there's no sense in discussing them at all, then we just end up with the implicit power, because those answers are there even if we do not discuss the questions explicitly. So what we need to make sense of this sort of approach to epistemology within the whole field of environmental ethics is an approach that is insofar systematic but also applicable, but on the other side, open for ongoing revisions of its scheme, where this application discloses its shortcomings, so that we can basically balance out those two extremes we had on the slide before that. If it just gets to be only abstract, then there's no link to experience, then there's no link to reality and its problems, so it won't make any sense to use that sort of epistemological discourse. But if there's a way to secure this applicability of questions about the world, human beings, all that, that also holds open the question of an ongoing revision of the scheme. Essentially what people like Carnap criticized about metaphysics not to have. the tendency to build an enclosed system of thought that is not open to revision due to some sort of experience contradicting those metaphysical questions, then we might get somewhere to a constructive approach to the problems Beck and Latour point to. So basically, we do need some conceptual tools to confront the forms of how we think about nature or the environment and its changes. And the outlook I can give you, or the proposal I can bring at this end, what I did spell out in the dissertation, where this kind of belongs to, is that an ontology like that of Alfred Whitehead, his process philosophy or philosophy of organism, tries to secure those two aspects, A and B, and therefore I think can be used to answer those problems Beck and Latour point to. It is by no means the only one that is able to do that. It is just my proposal to do so, and if this opens up a discussion about those epistemological and ontological questions that leads to other thinkers and other approaches to those questions being explicitly discussed, then I'm totally happy if we don't end up with Whitehead. Also, of course, we do need some concepts to link ontological schemes like that of Whitehead to our environmental problems. Just two examples here that can help. The term resilience has had huge success in just being used in a broad area of different fields everywhere where some sort of systems in change, system in context have to be regarded. It is used. It has some conceptual problems. I think also here some kind of systematic thinking can help. And the last example, integral ecology. So basically, for Francis and the encyclical Laudato Si, is also a field where we have this tension of it tries to address this layer of the problem. It leads to certain conceptual difficulties, and I think a discussion about those difficulties can really help in making the whole thing more stable.
All right.
Thank you for that.
Now, we have a good deal of time, I think, for questions. I said I would go ahead and moderate. Those of you who are online can feel free, I think, to use your put up your hand function, and I can call on you. But I think we'll start with the room for now. And if I might use my prerogative as moderator, I'll go ahead and start with a question about this idea of epistemology as a key to the problem. Epistemology understood in terms of how we grasp cognitive success or cognitive failure. One of the things that concerns me most about the debate around climate change in general, but even more broadly around environmental crisis and responses to it, is what I would call the problem of denial, or the problem of avoidance. And it's a complex phenomenon, but it's readily observable in that people have, as you said, access to knowledge about problems. They have knowledge about their connections to the problems, but this doesn't seem to spark not just changes in behavior, but acknowledgement of the problem. So the thing about denial is that psychologically, it can involve a form of knowing something without knowing it, or determining not to know something that we have some sense of. I wonder if that constitutes, that kind of dynamic, a cognitive failure, or if it's actually a cognitive success, because we succeed in shielding ourselves from knowing what is there to know. What do you think about that?
Well, first, thanks for the questions. It's an interesting one to think about a bit. I think it's two different aspects of the question. So just to the first one, I guess we can all agree that denial with regard to things like climate change and its consequences and what this means for our own ways of life is a complex problem. So if this approach with a focus on epistemology leads to some insight as to one layer of underlying causes of things like widespread denial, then I think it's already valuable enough to engage in this discourse, because I guess the hope that we find this one approach that will linearly solve the problem of denial with regard to climate change, I think we won't get it. So of course, there's way more layers to it with psychological problems and all those. So if this epistemological layer touches on all those questions and can be one way to explicitly discuss a layer of the problem that otherwise remains implicitly a part of the problem, then I think it's valuable enough to do it, even though we know that it won't solve the problem all by itself. So, and to the second aspect of your question, you're right that the question of is it cognitive success or cognitive failure also has more than one answer, or has maybe one answer, but this answer tends to change with the counterpart in the question. So yeah, if the goal of the cognitive engagement with the problem is to keep the stability of my way of living, then it is some kind of success to deny it effectively. I think that's kind of links to the whole question whether the enabling act of a trauma is a cognitive success or a cognitive failure. In some way, it is a success due to, in the first place, being a kind of failure. And so maybe can be seen as a similar thing with the denial of things like climate change, when the impact on our lives and the stability of those lives seems to be too big to take them. At the same time, I guess we can agree that it's never the ideal success that should be what we aim to. And so, yeah, maybe it's not just the binary of success and failure in this case.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Well, let's open things up to the room first. Adrian?
I think your answer just stumbled upon a part that we should consider as a part of the solution if one is available. And as I agree with you that our epistemological foundation is concurrent with everything that we do. More precisely, what you stumbled upon is about the convenience that our epistemological self has developed a technocratic way of looking at the world, and how we have developed our technology such that we have created an entity, if I could say that, a reality for us of which we cannot extricate ourselves. We are so dependent on a form of our socioeconomic, and nature is now not just an objective, you were saying it's an objective, but it's a commodity of possibility, a commodity of rational thinking. And not until, I would suppose, we can free ourselves from that convenience you said is available to us, then there is no solution, because I can't see what facet we would expunge ourselves of.
I agree with the danger of there not being a solution in this way. And yeah, I mean, if we just look at the whole processes of setting up political goals to limit even only one factor like global warming, it points way more to the direction of, well, we seem to be not that successful with the whole thing. So I mean, it's still just the challenge for ethical reflection doesn't stop there, where we see that the chances to get to a better solution may be small. I think one aspect that's inherent in what you just said is this aspect of and this would kind of be the second half of the critique of modernity Latour and Beck engage in. Because what I focused on was the epistemological part, and there's also something like an ontological part of it, where they point to a number of concepts that essentially circle around some notion of stasis, of static things, of a static world, which then kind of founds this notion of a essentially stable society and economy the way it is. This is why I pointed to this tension between the relative stability of our societies and which has all power to lead to a thinking of, well, how should this ever change? Maybe one way to question the stability is to see that this relative stability is only enabled by the accelerated transformation of something else, so that even this all too seemingly stable form of society is still part of the ongoing transformation of the world in a more general sense. But of course, I agree that the problems so far don't seem to go away.
Well, we have a question from our online audience. Mamuka, tell us where you're calling in from. Please speak up. We can't hear you. Although you're not muted. Might be our problem. Let's see. Mamuka, we can't hear you. Maybe you could put your question in the chat just to make sure that we. I'm very sorry, we don't have sound for you.
Can you hear me?
Oh yes, now we can hear you. Go ahead.
No, that's me.
Oh, that's you. Oh, okay. Yeah, we can hear you fine. All right, well, we'll see if we can get your sound fixed, or Mamuka, if you can put your question in the chat, that would help. John Krumkowski, you put in the chat very early on, does nature change? Are you expanding on that now? Let's see, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself? And speak?
He's still muted.
Yeah. Let me see if I can unmute this. Yes, I can.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is, since you started off with epistemology, and obviously that's a variety of ways of knowing as a sort of a generic explanation of what the word means. I'd like to know what you mean by nature, because if nature is constant, or perhaps nature as a process is what we're trying to know, then it seems to me we've got to clarify what is it you're talking about when you say nature, because is nature's like society, they change in different rhythms. I think, I'm pretty sure about that. Although I'm only 85 years old, and it may be that I'm just experiencing more changes than people usually talk about. So that's one question. The other is, it seems to me that there is a very, very important question that everyone has been dancing around, and that is the difference that I think really needs to be explicated and made very clear. there's a difference between episteme, between scientific knowledge, whether it's of nature, whether it's of society, whether it's philosophy or the social sciences, and the lived cultures of societies. The vast majority of people who do not spend their life in the search for knowledge, but spend their life in living and doing things and knowing something in a commonsensical way. So unless we, from my mind, unless we clarify what we mean when we're talking about nature and whether it changes, and what's the difference between the knowledge that we are trying to come to in research and in teaching, and then the knowledge that is part of the lived experience or life world of societies, we're simply going to be talking to ourselves in silos. And I don't think that those silos are going to be sustainable, particularly if there are power fields that are dominating both lived cultures and academic cultures. And unless we address that, we are probably not going to be able to be Zooming very well either, because they'll be censored in ways that make this kind of discussion, with all due respect to all of my life in the academic world, even more superfluous than it is.
There you go.
Thanks. I basically agree on the questions being relevant questions. So my answers aren't going to solve them in any way, but just to maybe make clearer how my approach to them would be to include them in what I'm trying to do in this specific part of work. So for the first thing with nature, the way I used it in the title and mostly throughout the presentation is just the broadest sense of the world out there in this case. Of course, the more we want to talk about nature, the more precise our concepts must get, but this wasn't the part I focused on here. So in this broad sense of nature being basically the world, and the world taken as those aspects primarily that we don't use more specific concepts like culture and human life world for, changes, of course. Maybe it has an even broader variety of levels of speed or of entangled systems that develop and change in different speeds. But I think that one of the basic insights we have from this whole problem field of climate change and planetary boundaries and all those things is that nature does change, or nature, at least taken as planet Earth, does change on all those levels. And one of the basic problems back in Latour point to is that as long as we take nature to be something stable, something essentially stable, something that will essentially stay the same and just be this passive counterpart as an object, as a material storage house for human interests, that doesn't change unless we make it change. But
I'm sorry, if I could just intervene here, because you're not addressing the question. Because if nature, as a reality, is fundamentally changing always, then knowing about change is the question about nature. Knowing about change. That is, the whole notion that somehow nature doesn't change is both on an academic level as well as a common sense level. Clearly and obviously, nature is changing every day. Now, there is one distinction within nature, as you've understood it, and I think that it was made pretty sharply by Hans Jonas, that there's a difference between nature that is not alive, inanimate nature, and live nature. So there's the question of what is life within nature. And then the question then of how nature is symbolized by various people who want to give us an account of nature. And I think a good place to start with that question is the Timaeus, as a rather awesome undertaking to explain all of reality. And then another question related to that is it eternal, or did it have a beginning? It seems to me those are the epistemological questions related to nature. And there's a tradition within which many societies operate that is important to understand, so that their relationship in action, not in thinking, but in action, can in fact be consonant with the symbolizations that have given them their stories about nature with a beginning or nature that is unending. And I think that's the very first, I think that's the most interesting question. And you're moving around it in ways, but because you didn't convince me, you didn't satisfy me, I'm agitated for truth. And in that respect, one of the things that is certainly part of what we ought to be doing is agitating the societies around us to understand the truth of our relationship to nature.
Well, I'm sorry to have disappointed you. Right now, I just have spoken to you in this audience here and to you in this audience in Zoom. So, of course, there is the open question of how is it possible to link those questions of the problem for fundamental ethics with this layer of life world. This is what I pointed to with concepts like resilience and integral ecology. I think the encyclical Laudato Si is one way to bring those questions of thinking about the world and its changes and how our systems of human society and basically just starting with our daily lives are linked to those processes in an ever-changing nature. The way we conceive of it is then the layer of ontology. This is where I propose to take Reiter's process ontology, which has huge similarities with Plato's Timaeus, but it just wasn't the focus I laid out today, because I chose to talk about epistemology of a problem of environmental ethics. So, yeah.
Fair enough.
Let me take one, just if I could just add one other sentence here. One of the fundamental questions of epistemology is whether we are interested in understanding and participating in nature, or are we involved in a fundamental critique and transformation of nature, which is fundamentally the way in which the Marxian critique of nature and the mission of action in history is to transform nature and make it into a new reality that is driven by action and by the image of human power. And these are two very different epistemologies: to understand or to change.
Yes.
So I come from a completely different background. I'm a physician and I come from the life sciences. And to me, what I wonder is, so the way you look at the question of the environment, I find it fascinating. And you said the obvious, it's not bound to national borders, but it's something that affects all of us. And what I wonder is, if you in Munich or in your field, how you connect to other fields. I was for a decade or a decade and a half part of the advisory board on the Freiburg Institute of Advanced Studies. And there I was fascinated as a life scientist to discuss with ethicists, to look at problems from very different angles. And I wonder, you coming from a philosophical angle, coming from an angle of epistemology, to see how do you interact with life scientists or environmental scientists to see in the end? I love this discussion, but I also wonder what can we take home with us as part of stepping closer towards a solution.
Thank you. I agree that what I did today was a very focused part on this philosophical question.
And I very much appreciated that actually.
It's
So,
embedded
thank you.
in the way to how we get to the problem that kind of makes us reflect on those epistemological questions. And this is the first thing where the interaction with life sciences, but basically the whole approach to questions about the way our world is changing comes to mind. So the whole field of Earth system research being what poses the problem to us that leads to those questions would be one thing. On maybe a second level, I think a figure like Bruno Latour is a good example of how those different questions of science and of the interpretation of science and of the place science has in modern societies can be discussed even even with the part of making art exhibitions on those questions, and so to engage with all those different areas of thinking and of approaching the world, and especially with this emphasis on the praxis of scientific thinking, on scientific knowledge, not just being isolated results of knowledge, but highly complex processes that lead to a certain assertion being regarded as scientific knowledge. And so this is the part of coming towards what I was saying of the problem, but of course also in how we think about ways of engaging with this problem and possible solutions. This term resilience I pointed to in the end is maybe one example, since especially with the Stockholm Resilience Center and its concept of planetary boundaries being one of the, at least maybe largest with regard to the scope of the concept, and also maybe with regard to how well known it is, tools to understand the complexity of the problem. This image of planetary boundaries, or this whole idea of having different aspects of this whole Earth system that cannot be solved or treated in isolation, but always have to be thought of in their interactions with those other aspects. So of course, those questions only lead to other approaches to those problems, where in order to get back into contact with from life world and just everyday practices up to life sciences and a more broadly engaged inter or transdisciplinary discourse becomes necessary part of what is to happen with such a work.
Good. We'll take one more question here, and then we'll go back to the online screen. Karin?
Thank you for your survey of epistemology and clarifications. You linked it very strongly to cognition and cognitive success and failure. And cognition itself is something that's often taken for granted about the type of reality that it reflects about us in the world. Don't you, to expand your search for this topic, especially the ethical aspect, into a closer understanding of the knowing self, so to speak? Yes, cognition and epistemology is about what we know and how we know, but the thing or the entity who is knowing is always a shadow behind it, which we often never touch. It's like the finger doesn't touch itself when it points. And Therefore, you mentioned ontology in your remarks, which is very appropriate, to go beyond our instrumental understanding of how we think and how we come to know something. And the wrong uses and abuses of knowledge in its technological applications are becoming much more evident to us now, although decades ago, no one ever questioned that. So we need to involve the being as well as the knowing aspect. And I'm sure you understand that, and in this short time that you had, you didn't address it, but I would encourage you to combine epistemology with anthropology, if you will. And so I thank you for your comments.
All right, we're going to go back to the online audience. Vic, please unmute yourself and.
Well, thank you for giving a chance to get into discussion. I think it was well provoked by Ivo's presentation. I would like to join John Kromkowski in his quest, because that is of real value when we speak about the lived cultures, which now change in the last decade from normal culture, I would call it logocentric culture, to screen culture of our mobile devices, which are in millions of pockets around the clock. And that changes a lot, both in epistemology and in inanimate nature. Because if you look at the side of the nature, there is the Internet of Things, which allows any inanimate object to be introduced into feedback connections with us, the humans, being as part of the live nature. And that changes a lot of things when we reflect on that, how these things are to be understood and what impact can we exert when we are trying to act. And if we look at the lived culture side, then having this cyberspace, it is also divided into two parts. One is cyber culture, where there are some rules which we do obey, like in our meeting today. But there is a much larger part of cyberspace where no rules at all are applicable. And that is that has a very powerful impact on the ends of the epistemology and gnoseology as well, because that changes a lot of things, because the veracity and the quest for the truth is now absolutely subverted and undermined by the easy possibility of faking realities. And now the nature of cognition and understanding has completely reversed the old model of education and the old ways of living normally in present day life. Today, you have to get the instinct of looking into what is not probable or what looks to be probable, but doesn't act as such. So there is a host of so many problems that need to be at least marked in a dissertation so that we could see the encompassing environment. Thank you for Mr. Kromkowski for introducing this into the debate, but I think we all will reflect on that. Thanks a lot.
Any comments in response? Thank you for the comment.
Did you hear a question here?
Mm-hmm. Any other questions in the room? Yes. Let's try Mamluka one more time. Can you speak and see if we can get any sound for you? Let's see, I'm going to mute you and then unmute you.
Можно говорить.
Let's see. Yeah.
One more question.
All right. Sorry about that.
And this develops on everybody else's at Kromkowski's, but I was thinking about rational power our intellectual power and its exploration, it seems to, in some degree, has escaped even nature. And what I mean by that, when you were speaking of physics, we have now transformed the heavens, the outer spaces, and we're not sure outer space conforms to what we know as nature. And at one time, that exploration was about knowing who are we in the scheme of things. But it has now become about a domination. It has become a militarized zone used for the purposes of, now we don't even know what the geographical boundaries are. We have even escaped that. And I guess that it seems to me that knowing is no longer a goal. Like the spaceship, drops off things as it heightens, that we are more about the domination of whatever is. So my question is, do we not need to perhaps discern what that is in our species, in our very being, which seems to be independent of knowledge, independent and focus more on freedom and possibility? What is that act?
It is an interesting additional question. I'm not so sure whether knowledge becomes irrelevant. Knowledge becomes part of a complex of different approaches in which we are in contact with the world around us. Knowledge might be only in an extreme case really only an end in itself, but always linked to. Traditionally, there are quite a huge variety of different concepts of what is the role knowledge plays. I tend to sympathize with a pragmatical one to say that, well, knowledge becomes relevant when we encounter some sort of problem, some notion of a difference between possibilities of how things in the world can proceed, and where we have an interest in making the one possibility realized and the other not. And so their knowledge about what it is that enables us to realize those possibilities becomes relevant. And so even when, with regard to things like space, issues of power or dominance, be it just using the materials out there for our own interests, be it using the space out there to defeat our enemies here on Earth. In all those cases, knowledge still forms a relevant part, not just as an end in itself, but as a part of the complex of our whole approach to make sense of or to make the world develop more in line of the possibilities we'd like it to develop into. And so, of course, the question of what is it that brings us to engage with the world in such a way is an important part of the questions. That is why Ulrich Beck and Bruno Latour spent numerous works on the question of what it is that characterizes us as the moderns in all the imperfect sense that it has, that characterizes those moderns in a way that leads to this specific relation to nature. So yeah, that's part of this whole question of why such things like epistemology become a problem with regard to environmental ethics, which I just had to leave out here because of focus. But yeah, you're totally right that this is kind of the background of this whole question.
We will take one more question, and then we'll invite the people who are here for a bit of lunch. If you can stick around, we have some pizza. I'm fear that for the people online, all we can offer is intellectual sustenance for today. Marcus, you have the last question.
Okay, thank you. I would like to add an aspect of the first question Bill raised, the problem of denial and avoidance of getting aware to know what we could know. Is it not more also a question of emotions? And I think climate change is a question of morality, a question of emotion, because the world we live in is unsure and connected with suffering, and we don't like that kind of knowledge. And John Haidt reflects about the role of emotion in the context of ethics. And he says we have to get more aware about the emotional avoidance of getting aware to know what we don't like. And I think Sloterdijk points it out very clearly. He said, we do not know because we don't like it to know. And so it's what he says, we do not believe in what we know. And I think it's also from the perspective of theology and in aspect, we have no trust in our knowledge, scientific knowledge, and we try to avoid it. And we have such a lot of knowledge so that we like not to see it. And it's you can connect it with the biblical approach from Matthäus. We have ears to hear, but we don't hear. We have eyes to see, but we don't see. And I think though it could be interesting for you to connect your metaphysical and epistemological reflections more with the reflection on the role of emotions in the context of ethics and climate change.
I think it would at least be a certain and an important part of connecting it with all the questions of life sciences we heard about earlier. So yeah, definitely an interesting and valuable additional layer.
All right, well, let us thank our speaker one last time. This is all of you for coming out today, and for all of you for joining us from around the world. And I hope you'll be able to join us again for our next event on the 23rd. We'll send out another announcement. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill, for organizing all.